If you have ever written or attempted to write a work of fiction, tell me if this sounds familiar. You have an initial book idea that you're really excited about. Maybe it's a specific character or scene or plot concept that you just cannot wait to get down on paper. So you sit down to write. Maybe you even make it a few chapters in, and then suddenly the wind leaves your sails. You hit a slump. You can't tell where the story is going, and maybe your characters just don't feel compelling anymore. Worse, perhaps you're recognizing that you started to over rely on tropes and cliches because you're not sure what else to do. That scene or character that inspired you in the first place is still there somewhere waiting to be written, but you don't know how to get there. Is it a skill issue? Well, I mean, it certainly could be, but more than likely, it could be a story issue. Enter Story Genius by Lisa Cron, or if I use its full title, Story Genius: How to Use Brain Science to Go Beyond Outlining and Write a Riveting Novel Before You Waste 3 years Writing 327 Pages That Go Nowhere. I initially picked up this book because I wanted to see if it would be a good fit for Howdy Curiosity's first book club. More on that in just a moment, wink wink nudge nudge. And I just finished reading through it for the first time. I've really been enjoying it overall, and I have quite a bit that I want to unpack. To get things started, I want to give a high-level oversimplification of the book's general premise, which is that people are wired towards story and that understanding the elements of story make for more compelling and engaging writing. But most writers aren't actually taught how to construct stories. If I may editorialize a bit, and I definitely can, or I wouldn't be making videos about books that I've read, I think avid readers and studiers of literature can intuit the ingredients of story, but I do agree with Cron that most of us aren't taught how to construct stories, and that we tend to get bogged down with some of the myths and misconceptions about what actually goes into making for a good story. Thinking back to my own writing education, what I most often encountered were simple plot diagrams that broke narratives down into 5 major parts: introductions, rising actions, the climax, falling actions, and resolutions. And here's where some healthy pedantry comes into play. These oversimplistic plot diagrams that we're taught represent the structure of a story that actually obscure what a story is. They teach us to conflate things like plot, conflict, and story as a singular aspect of a work of writing rather than distinct pillars of the craft. Here, I want to quote Cron and the introduction of the book because I think she does a beautiful job setting the stage for what story is and how it functions. The problem is that most writers mistake story for the things we can see on the page: the stunning prose, the authoritative voice, the intense and exciting plot, the clever structure. It's a very natural mistake and a crippling one, because while no one could deny that all those things are important, they lack the crucial element that gives a story meaning and brings it to life. What drives a story forward is, at first blush, invisible. It's not talent, it's not voice, it's not the plot. Think electricity. The same way even the most powerful lamp is useless unless it's plugged in, a story can't engage readers without the electricity that illuminates the plot, the voice, and the talent, bringing them to life. The question is, what specifically generates that juice? The answer is, it flows directly from how the protagonist is making sense of what's happening, how she struggles with, evaluates, and weighs what matters most to her, and then makes hard decisions, moving the action forward. This is not a general struggle, but one based on the protagonist's impossible goal: to achieve her desire and remain true to the fear that's keeping her from it. As we'll explore in detail, story is not about the plot or what happens. Story is about how the things that happen in the plot affect the protagonist and how he or she changes internally as a result. As I was reading through Story Genius, especially the first 2 parts of the book, I kept going back to some of the most commonly cited advice I read about query letters, which is that they should essentially set up who your protagonist is, what they want, and what's stopping them from getting it. Reading through Cron's book had me reflecting that this oft-quoted query letter advice could be simplified even further to say that your query letter should communicate the essence of the story you're trying to tell, with plot details layered on top, of course. But at this point, we're far way away from query letters. We're still focused on getting our story right. So let's dive into an overview of the book, how it's structured, and who should be reading it. At the macro level, Story Genius has a three-part structure. Part 1, a quick 25 pages, only 2 chapters, is an overview of what story is and what it isn't. Here, Cron outlines her thesis of why story is so important to the success of a narrative, both in terms of its reception with readers, but also for the person doing the writing. It's a lot easier to write a novel if you know where it's going and why than if you don't, after all. In this section, she also does a lot of work to do some mental spring cleaning. As I've already mentioned, many of us have had writing educations and experiences of varying qualities. And we've probably internalized a lot of misunderstandings and myths about what stories are and are not, as well as the immortalized strategies for writing that seem to have a chokehold on the writing community. The second chapter of part 1 is devoted to unpacking these myths, with considerable time spent to exploring ideas of starting in the middle of the action, pantsing, that is the school of writing that believes the best way to write is to sit down and write by the seat of your pants, plotting, which is the counterpoint to pantsing, where everything is mapped out before you begin drafting, shitty first drafts, and external story structures. I don't want to put words in Cron's mouth, but she seems to be suggesting that each of these approaches and paradigms ultimately limits writers rather than empowers them. From her point of view, the best approach is to have an intimate understanding of the story you're telling before you start writing, which means having a clear understanding of your character, their problems and struggles, and how they interact with and view the world. That then brings us to part 2 of the book, which is all about creating the protagonist's inside story by deeply understanding their past. In part 2 of the book, you really get a sense for Cron's methodologies because each chapter is anchored around an exercise, or, as is more often the case, a series of exercises that are meant to get you as the reader to not only learn about story by reading about its concepts, but also by doing hands-on exercises. Cron will frame these chapters by starting each section with a combination of research mixed with an anecdote to illustrate why certain aspects of story are important to readers. What are the aspects of psychological research we can learn from to unpack how story works? What is it about certain narratives that hook readers while other narratives push readers away? From there, she'll often pivot into an example of working through these concepts with one of her clients. Someone has an idea, but they just don't know how to develop it or get it to where they want it to go, so they turn to Cron for help. Coming out of these client conversations, Cron constructs writing exercises, which are noted in the book under the bold header, What to Do. You'll see in my copy that I have flagged many of these with orange flags so that I could return to them later. This cadence remains pretty consistent for the entirety of part 2. Honestly, at first, I had mixed feelings about a lot of these exercises. Typically, when I sit down to read, I want to sit down and read, only read. I don't like getting out of reading mode and going into journaling or writing mode. I think those types of exercise-heavy books are much better suited for book clubs and workshop groups than they are for solo reading because of how disrupting the context switching can be to read a few pages, put a book down, write, pick the book back up, and repeat. But the longer I sat with the book, the more I appreciated what Cron was doing. She really does force you to think about the hard questions underpinning your book up front. The subtitle of Before You Waste 3 Years Writing 327 Pages That Go Nowhere felt quite true when I took the time to step back and acknowledge that on more than one occasion, many more than one occasion, I've managed to crank out 50, 60, even 100 pages of a novel only to realize that I wasn't in love with the story, or that I didn't have a good answer for why the protagonist would care about, let alone get involved in, the central conflict. So, Part two of the book was a bit frustrating, but it was the good kind of frustration you feel when you are doing something that you know is forcing you to learn and expand your skills. I recently spoke to Cron, and she had a bit of a chuckle when I mentioned that I got frustrated with her and the fact that Story Genius is not a relaxing book. She agrees. And as she rightly states, writing is hard work. A 2022 study suggested that of the people who start writing a novel, only 3% make it to the end of their draft. And what is the number of completed drafts that get published? It's astoundingly small. Cron knows that writing isn't easy, and she makes no pretenses about her writing exercises being easy. But she advises that if you stick with it and do the hard work up front, you are far more likely to be among the 3% who have a completed manuscript one day. When I started working my way through the book, I found myself hesitating with a few of the exercises at first. Not only were they a little challenging, but I also wasn't clear on how Cron intended for those exercises to be used. Whether she intended for readers of her book to directly incorporate those scenes into their manuscripts as flashbacks or scenes that unfolded directly on the page or not wasn't completely clear to me. And the implications of what it meant, if they were, didn't sit right with me. But as I stuck with this part of the book, I realized that Cron's methodologies weren't so that I would have background information to copy and paste directly into my book, but rather so that I would know the inner machinations of my own protagonist. Those background scenes may pop up throughout the manuscript referentially, but they may also just influence how the protagonist acts and reacts. Going back to the metaphor she uses that I mentioned earlier, those scenes become the character's memories that give the novel the sense of electricity that drive it forward. Going into part three of Story Genius, Cron steps back and says, okay, you've delved into the inner depths of your protagonist and the necessary components of story that drive your narrative forward. So now we can layer on all of the plot and scene elements on top of that. In the opening chapter of part three, titled The Opening of Your Novel and of the Story Genius Blueprinting System, Cron writes, so what exactly is a novel blueprint and how does it help you create a plot that touches on the third rail, a metaphor for story that she's used throughout the book? I thought you'd never ask. In a nutshell, a novel blueprint is a scene-by-scene progression of your external plot, as driven by the internal struggle each event triggers in your protagonist. You'll begin to build your blueprint based on everything you've unearthed in the process thus far. You've already seen how your protagonist's past has guided his life up to the tick that will open your novel. Now it's time to plumb that past, often digging yet deeper into it. The better to nail down the events it will thrust your protagonist into, along with his reaction to them. As with part two, Cron continues to give what to do prompts to guide readers through exercises to help them build out their scene-by-scene blueprints. And in this section, she also introduces frameworks for structuring scene cards, which break down the key scenes of your novel by the cause and effect they have on both the plot and the third rail or story. Over the course of part three, Cron doesn't advocate for a linear structure of scenes where A happens, then B, then C, then D, all the way down to Z. The first chapter of part three is about constructing your opening scene, but the second chapter of part three is about constructing your ending scene and understanding your protagonist's culminating realizations so that your novel's blueprint is bookended with the opening and closing scenes. From there, she essentially advocates for starting to fill in the gaps, using folders to keep yourself organized as you build upon your causes and effects to navigate your way intuitively from that first scene to your last scene. Additionally, she explores how to integrate side characters, subplots, and layered conflicts into this framework. After all, if novels read like Rube Goldberg machines or sequences of dominoes, they wouldn't be quite as engaging as they actually are. So, who should read this book? Here's the thing. I think a lot of writers are going to hear about the methodologies of this book and bristle up at first. For a long time, I was something of a pantser, Or perhaps you could say an art purist, where I wanted my writing to be fueled by inspiration and excitement. And I found frameworks for pre-planning my work to be too restrictive. I was really fond of saying things like, I don't tell my stories, my characters do. But those stories were, frankly, all quite sophomoric. They had a rustic charm to them, let's say. If these methodologies feel restrictive at first, but result in a better story, I'm willing to give them a try and see how things play out. Plus, one of the biggest challenges I hear from other writers, especially writers who also have full-time jobs or family obligations, which, let's be real, that is pretty much every single writer these days, is that when they have these rare, precious moments to actually sit down and write, their minds go blank. They feel stuck and end up feeling like they've wasted their writing time doing nothing because they just couldn't get their gears turning. I think the approach Cron lays out could be a great remedy for that. If you front load the preparation and invest time in getting to understand your characters deeply, and then map out scene by scene what you want to happen, it takes less brain power to, if you front load the preparation and invest time in getting to understand your characters deeply, and then map out scene by scene what you want to happen, it takes less brain power to orient yourself and figure out what you want to write when you finally do get to sit down and actually do the damn writing. In fact, when I interviewed Lisa recently, she mentioned that basically all of her clients are working professionals or parents, many both professionals who are also parents, who rely on implementing the story-driven methods she outlines in her books so that they can create more productively when they have time to sit down and work. The more time I spend with her work and her methodologies, the more I think about it like investing money. At first, the process can feel stressful and make you wonder if it's even worth it. But over time, it pays off in spades. The same is true for the Story Genius approach. At first, it is going to feel incredibly time consuming and at times tedious. But if you do it and if you lay the groundwork successfully, you'll be much better off in the long run and able to draft incredibly efficiently once you reach that point. So I think all writers of fiction would be a good fit for this book. Even if it doesn't sound like it meshes with your current writing style, you'll learn something new about story from it. Plus, one of the things that I love about nonfiction and books like this is that you don't have to agree with them 100% or apply every single lesson to the T for them to be valuable for you. Some parts may resonate with you more than others, and you may get significant value from a few of the activities, but not from others. To me, that makes it worth it. Over at the Howdy Curiosity Community, we are starting to host book clubs. These will be held fully remote friendly via Zoom, so as long as you register and the time slots work for you, you can attend. Because I think Story Genius is such an interesting book for writers to read regardless of their experience level, it's going to be our first book club pick. I fully embrace doing hard things because hard work pays off. And the exercises throughout this book will push you to do hard things as a writer, but I think there's so much to learn and so much to unpack, especially with other writers, which is why I cannot wait for us to discuss this as a group. If you're interested in joining the book club, you can head over to connect.howdycuriosity.com/story-genius to learn more and register today. The link is also in the description of this video if you're watching on YouTube, so you do not need to memorize the URL that I just rambled off. Our book clubs will have a maximum attendance cap, so act fast if you want to save your seat. We'll have one session to go over parts 1 and 2 of the book, another session for part 3, and then a final session to wrap up and share reflections and notes from the exercises throughout the book. I am super excited and can't wait for us to all dive in together. Plus, because these book clubs are new for Howdy Curiosity, If you go check out the registration page and realize that the time slots won't work with your schedule, there is an option to let us know what times would work better for you, which will be incredibly helpful for me to figure out if we need to offer a second book club option or how to schedule book clubs better moving forward. Plus, you'll be the first to know about new book clubs that do match your schedule. As always, if you've liked this video, please like and subscribe so that we can keep making more. To check out Story Genius and other great works of nonfiction for yourself, visit our website at www.howdycuriosity.com and use the code YouTube5 for 5% off any purchase at checkout. I'm going to go to the gym and pick up heavy things repeatedly while listening to rap music at an unhealthy volume now. So I will see you next time, folks.